down, Ana Maria, Aida. Okay, good morning to you all. Welcome to the second day of the Let's Lack
Recording in
workshop.
progress.
And good morning to everyone that arrived today. And thank you very much for those that didn't leave, for those that are here with us today. We're going to start today by talking about yesterday and sharing the agenda for day 2. And to start with the yesterday, I'm going to give the floor to Alexis. Good morning to all of you. Let's review what happened yesterday. There have been moments, plenary moments, but also parallel session moments. So not everyone is informed, not everyone's on the same page. So we're going to start with information on day 1 so that day 2 is more, flows better. Next one, please. And I wanted to talk to you about the program yesterday. So we started with some expectations before starting with session 1.
De las expectativas, se han armado una especie de 5 grupos de
So we have 5 expectations group
bastante grandes de reconexión. Bien interesante.
Reconnection. It's very interesting because you see the need to reconnect with a network, to be with the new participants in Let's Lack. So contact network, networking, alliances. So we have to use all the spaces to create alliances to connect. A second point that came from the expectations was learning from experiences. Many of you want to show what you're doing, and so here we are polishing the spaces that we are creating. Okay, so in the third one, we have knowledge. What do I want to learn? What do I want to get to know about during these 3 days? We have seen a lot of ideas regarding projects and mechanisms that could be used for funding. This is related to funding. And here there are some post-its that talk about other things, like, for example, accelerating climate action, leveraging new opportunities, deepening ideas regarding new transportation, having new practice communities, and discuss practices related to carbon and NSs. So we see some very interesting expectations, and we also have some key ideas, like, for example, creating a roadmap to accelerate the climate action in LAC towards COP30, and also having ambitious results and measures with groups with a high ambition as well. This space must be useful for the roadmap and to increase ambitions. So those are the expectations that we've had, and day to day we see these processes in the platform. In the morning, we've had 2 sessions where we have all participated. One is on the stock take, and I think it was pretty interesting to get to know about this. And there's an exercise that we did all together. The second plenary that was on instruments to implement the SNESs, and we had different contributions. But yesterday we were not able to communicate all of these contributions, so we're going to leave them on the panel so that you can have them. And today we're going to keep working on these needs. What do we need to keep making progress and implementing NSs, but also the opportunities for collaboration. So here we have a lot of information, and so during the breaks you can read it and you can see what has come from each group. And in the afternoon, we have had 3 parallel theme sessions. And I'm going to invite you so that those that have been supporting these parallel sessions can tell us what are the three key ideas that have come from the spaces. So I'm going to invite Aida Lorenzo so that she gives us these three key ideas. Then Rocio Aldana, technical expert on articulation, and Martina Puno she's the coordinator of the transportation work group. So let's start with Aida Lorenzo. Thank you. Good day to you all. My name is Aida Lorenzo. I am a coordinator for the Practical Community on Energy. Yesterday's session was very interesting. Well, it had 12 people in the room and 12 people connected. And so we were asked for three key ideas. The session was an opportunities to reduce methane emissions, and this is related with biomass, with everything that's created in different sectors. What opportunities do we have? We thought that they were in several sectors, but we focused on agri-industrial and agriculture and farming. But what happens in the country, sometimes we don't have the baseline regarding the potential. So it's very important for the countries to start with the potential, to be clear on the potential to reduce emissions and how we move that potential to have financing or funding for these projects. So we need to have the baseline. We need to know what are the technologies that we can use for this reduction. Then we have to be able to go to the bench and say, this is what we have in this country, in this sector, this baseline, and we have a roadmap to reduce it like this. But we all agree that we have to educate the bank. How do I know it's sustainable, etc.? And finally, the other key idea is how do we link this with the climate action, with the climate policies? And so there is a big difference. Private sector works on one hand, we have public policies, but we don't relate them, we don't link them. So it's very important to say this project that we will do with this baseline goes with this NS measure, and with this we can reduce this amount of emissions, and this can bring this or that to the country. So that's a very important linkage, and there is also the linkage with the academia. The academia has a lot to say, and we see a lot of potential in these two communities, methane and bioenergy, to reduce emissions in several sectors. Sometimes we think it's only in solid waste, but no, it can be in agriculture and farming, it can be in agro-industry, and in solid waste. So there's a big potential for projects, but they need to be coordinated and linked with the key people and players, so that this is a sector that contributes much more to the emission reduction. Thank you very much, Aida. A round of applause for her. And now let's give the floor to Rocio. Thank you, Alexis, and good morning to you all. In group 2, we were talking about how to articulate public and private sectors in the implementation of national adaptation plans. And so we presented a toolbox on how to articulate these players in the implementation of national adaptation plans. And then we had a game where we discussed more deeply certain guiding questions. And so the key aspects that I would bring out is that in the analysis that we did of all the adaptation plans, all of these tools do mention the private sector and the importance of articulating both sectors in the process. The other thing is that the private sector is implementing measures, but these measures are not aligned with the national plans or with national tools. So we have to work on that guideline. One of the things that I like to highlight is that for now there's no adaptation system for adaptation as there is in mitigation. And this voluntary report system was very helpful in mitigation. The companies need these kinds of incentives or acknowledgments to be able to move forward in climate action. So we have work to do regarding that. And the last thing that I would say is, well, incentives for private sector. We we're not talking about economic terms, but they say that a type of incentive is capacity strengthening or acknowledging leadership, because sometimes they are implementing adaptation measures. Thank you very much for that summary, Rocio. And now let's listen to Martina. Let's have Martina. Good morning to all of you. I am Martina Puno. I am a coordinator of the transportation work group. Yesterday, we were leading a session called Boosting Transportation Through Resource Efficiency. And we proposed a different vision on how to attain transportation decarbonization and how we can support resource efficiency. We talked about three areas. First one is the most traditional one. How can we be efficient regarding energy and vehicle fleet migration towards new ways? But we also added two areas that have to do with the use of soils, the use of the land, and how through territory planning we can use better the land to avoid a lot of trips or change a lot of trips. And here we have a big gap that we have to start solving so that we can reach all the needs that we have in terms of climate change. The third area that we discussed was circular economy and what's its role regarding the different parts of transportation that we find. For example, vehicles that are not useful anymore, but we also talked about infrastructure and how the different materials we can reuse or retransform different aspects. We had a workshop-like activity, and in that activity, 10 people that are here participated, but we also had 10 virtual participants that helped us build recommendations for these terms. And among the most interesting things that have appeared, the different challenges that we have in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's very important to continue having multi-sectorial dialogue tables. At our table, we had participants from the public sector, from the private sector, from the third sector, and the construction was very rich, and that made us understand that it's very, very important to foster these kinds of spaces. It's valuable. And we also talked about how to land the different plans and capacities that we have towards smaller scales to reinforce subnational governments, small and medium companies that cannot always attain funding like big companies. And we detected a huge opportunity in terms of capacity strengthening, not only for necessary links, but also to all communities so that they can understand this perspective and so that they can think on transportation decarbonization in a wider manner, not only in terms of energetic efficiency, but also in terms of territory planning and from the circular economy perspective. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martina, for this summary. As you can see, we worked on these three parallel sessions yesterday. And then we had the marketplace, where we had 15 initiatives, people from the governments, NGOs, the private sector, and cooperation that could also present their actions. And there was an exchange. It was the first exchange that we had in an open space yesterday. And today, what we want to do is have two plenaries. We have the plenary three on climate funding in the region, and we will briefly start with that session. And then we have the next session on public private articulation for investment mobilization. So we have these two plenary sessions, but in the afternoon, we also have a lot of movement. From 12:30, we will start pitching in open spaces. Yesterday, we told you about this briefly, and we have three people inscribed. We are missing six inscriptions. And so I wanted to show you here how we have achieved three topics. What's the open space about? It's the moment to talk about a topic, a new topic. Put the topic on the table, have people inscribe in this topic so that we can ask more questions and we can enrich a certain question, a certain idea. And I think that it's important that we can take advantage of this. It's important to see these three that we have here, and maybe you want to add topics. So at 12:30, you're going to have some time to explain the topic that you want to talk about and what questions you want to ask. And in the afternoon, as soon as we come back from lunch, we're going to work. We will sit at the tables and start with those discussions. So this is going to enrich any question that you might have. So it's and then we're going to have a plenary and then parallel sessions. But this is a very free space. That's why it's called open space. And so we have three topics: the National Registry for Mitigation Measures in Peru and the carbon market. Here we have the Ministry of the Environment that has already they will want to have your feedback. And so you can talk about what's happening in your country regarding measured inscription. The other topic is the participation of ESLA and the Brazilian Hub. So here, Maria Gracia has written down that she's from the Avina Foundation to be able to do some. And she wants to know how the participation would be like and how we can strengthen that. The third topic that we talked about yesterday is how let's like help with green hydrogen in the region. And here Daniela has inscribed herself voluntarily to be able to ask some questions and talk about green hydrogen. So we have three tables where we can write our names so that we can have these very nice discussions. And so I wanted to know if you have other topics that you would like to put here. For example, topics on which you want to get feedback, on which you want to ask questions. Like, for example, how to disseminate an innovation, or or maybe someone has a concern that you want to have answers about. Let's have at least three more tables so that we can work together on this in the afternoon. Or maybe give me ideas. Can someone talk about a topic? Don't be shy. You can raise your hands. Nothing. We only have three topics. I can see you want to say something. Ah, they forced me. How can we talk about degrowth as a fundamental strategy to reduce emissions? But I'm still thinking about the question. Or maybe we can also talk about gender. And we often don't talk about that. How quick are we growing as a human population? And can that driver be affected by public policy? Okay, I think this is a very big question.
Florentino, te invito a que te puedas inscribir. Ponte el título ahí
Okay,
y
so
comienza.
write the title there and let's open a table regarding this.
Podemos colocarle
Aida is going to help you find your title
¿no? Y cómo eso puede
on
impactar en
growth
nuestro
and
país.
how this can impact
Ok, ya
policies.
tenemos a Florentino. Ahora
Okay,
le
so
voy
we
a
have a
las otras mesas.
Florentino. I'm going to get closer to the other
Aparece, por favor.
tables. Let me see.
Sí, bueno, buenos días. A mí me
Good
gustaría
morning.
poder presentar la guía de planificación de inversiones que
I'm
desarrollamos en
going
Legacy
to
Partnership. Entonces,
present
quisiera
the
conocer
guide that we
acerca de
present
su
in the missing
visión, su
partnership.
proceder
So
y las
I
experiencias
would
que
like
ustedes
to
tienen
know your
actuando.
experiences,
Entonces,
your perspectives.
voy a registrarme. Sí.
So I'm going
Muy bien, Adrián. Entonces te invito a que puedas colocar, toma acá hay el
to
lapicero.
enroll myself,
Tenemos. Y
write down my idea and enroll myself.
¿quién más quisiera comentar o
Okay,
ir
who
a
else would
presentar?
like to comment on something, disseminate something,
Algo que quieran
get
hacer.
help on a product, on a strategy?
¿Tú?
You?
¿Quieres proponer a alguien por acá, por esta mesa?
Do you want to
¿Algún tema?
propose someone here?
¿Tienen alguna pregunta, algún
Any
tema?
topics?
Pueden hacerlo abiertamente también ahora sí.
You can also do it
Como Florentino,
openly,
y puede ser que sea
like
después porque
Florentino.
no hay ninguna pregunta todavía. Por ahora no. ¿Tú?
Yo te lo puedo decir y tú lo dices en español.
Tenemos que hablar.
Sí, claro, claro.
Todo. Ya, acá.
Denle el micrófono y nosotros vamos a traducir. ¿Puede usar el micrófono, por favor? ¿Puede usar el micrófono la señora? Vayan, por favor, para que usen el micrófono.
Sorry. I guess the topic is more about how to kind of close the loop between what is happening on the ground and what is happening at the national or even kind of more international levels, and kind of opening those levels of communication between the bottom up and sort of the top down processes.
Sí, básicamente cómo se puede conectar las iniciativas locales que ocurren a nivel territorial, municipal, con los niveles más altos, no solamente a lo mejor nacional, sino que regional, que a veces pareciera como que uno esperaría que hubiese una conexión y una coordinación, pero no siempre ocurre, ¿no? Entonces, eso, como el bottom-up.
Sí. Sí, Ana María, me parece súper interesante el tema porque es una
I think that the topic is very interesting because we have had this discussion yesterday. Yesterday in Block 2, we have had the territorial approach, and yes, Allison, maybe the topic is multi-level coordination, coordination between different levels, local level, the national level, the international level. This is a topic that needs to be discussed. And we have another topic there, Allison. Maybe you can work with Aida. We have two more. Another topic that I found very interesting. I couldn't be in the third table, but looking at the relationship between bioenergy, sustainable mobility. I think that our countries have used electrical mobility, but are going towards electrical mobility. But the second and third generation biofuels are also interesting. And we should talk about how this can contribute to towards mobility. Okay, so please go to Aida. Go to Aida so that you can work together on your question, so that you can work on the topic together. Okay, just to contribute with what Allison said, what's happening here is how are these topics coordinated and how do they contribute to the global agenda? And so she mentioned the Framework Convention of the United States, how Latin America has a narrative what are the challenges that we have and how they can mobilize more funding towards the region, and how can the global agenda incorporate local realities from our countries, cities, and the territory.
Claro, ahí ya viene.
Yes, there is a sub-question on this issue for this table. I think that's interesting. Do you have to give some ideas? No. Somebody else? No. We're okay then. So we have 7 tables. We're going to ask you during the coffee break to register in these tables. We don't need to have anything prepared. It's just a conversation and some key ideas that we can share and share tomorrow with our other colleagues too. At 12:30, you can have a short pitch about proposing something at the table tomorrow. You can do this over coffee. That's okay. So we are finishing this section, and just 2 indications. So let's put the next slide. The first one, as we have seen, is 7 topics that we have for the open space tables, and you can register at coffee time. Okay, that's the first indication. The second is that for the parallel sessions, can you update this? So in the afternoon, we have 2 parallel sessions too. One about carbon markets and another one about innovation. So during the coffee break, do register, because we have to separate the rooms for the afternoon. We'll have a plenary session after the open space about funding for protecting nature, and then we divide the rooms. Those are the 2 indications we wanted to give you. If everything's okay, we're going to eat at 1 p.m. today. That's what we're proposing. I pass the floor to Vicky now, so she starts session 3. Okay, we start day 2. It's still too high for me. We start session 2 today, and we're going to focus on mobilizing investment financing. We have a first plenary session that will be focused on conditions for mobilizing climate financing, that is co-organized by Let's Lack and IDB. It will have 2 instances. First one, context, by Sandra Guzman, who's going to talk about the regional context for climate funding, and then a panel of experiences. Also with Sandra, but we will have 2 other panelists on strategies and instruments for climate financing in the region. It will be moderated by Raul Delgado from the ITP, and then I'll present the other, I'll introduce the other panelists. So I would now like to introduce Sandra Guzman. She's a specialist on low carbon development and climate funding. She is founder and general director of the group of climate funding for LAC. She is doctor on policies by the University of York in the UK, and she also has a master's degree in environment at Oxford University. She's a specialist on energy and environment by Flaxo, and she had her BA in Mexico. She was director for the Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources in Mexico, and she has participated in the Homework Bound project on strengthening women in science, with whom she visited the Antarctic to talk about climate change. Why didn't you tell us that before? We have to talk about that. She had an award as an Intellectual of the Year in 2018, and she was named as one of the 24 change making women, I think she said. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here, Sandra, and I pass the mic. Thank you very much. Hello, good morning to you all. It's a pleasure for me to be here and particularly to share with many friends of many years of fight. We have to say that we have been fighting for many years, and despite the fact that we are more visible now, there's much to do. We monitor climate funding because we're aware that one of the most important things we have right now is how to invest in these changes we need in reducing emissions and adaptation. But it's not only more money, but it's also a better quality of funding. What I'm going to talk about today is an overview. We update financing flows annually in the region, and I'm going to talk about the estimations, preliminary estimations, because our annual analysis is in the funding week. I invite you to participate from October 22 to 26. And I can give you some preliminary info so that you can get to know the trends and what we are saying in terms of climate funding. First of all, I'd like to start with some context. We said yesterday that the IPCC has pointed out that we have to reduce emissions significantly. In 2018, we said we need 45%. In 2022, we said, no, it's not enough. We need to reduce at least 50% of emissions. Unfortunately, what we currently have with the nationally determined contributions is that we are not reaching that reduction, but in some countries we would increase emissions. And now we are stopped in a trajectory of 3 degrees centigrade. One of the big progresses of the Paris Agreement was Article 2.1c, that states that we have to make financial flows consistent with low emission development of all kinds of flows, not only public but also private. That was one of the big agreements, because it's not enough with increasing climate funding. We have to transform the funding model in the financial sector, because we're investing a lot on extractive activities, and we'll see that. So the problem is that at funding level, there are some commitments. You might remember the $100 billion established in 2019, and that has not been achieved. Even if they were achieved, they are much under what we need. According to the Permanent Funding Committee, we would need $5.8 billion to 2030. That's 589 billion per year, and that's only based on estimations of some developing countries, because not all developing countries have established estimations of the cost of their needs regarding climate change. In Latin America, we have established that the cost is 1.3 million to 2030, but only 11 countries have established some financial needs. Just a few know how much we spend in adaptation. Mostly is related to mitigation. And we also have a problem. The pandemic affected the climate funding trajectory. And what we saw in the pandemic has to do with not only deviation, but also diversion, but the reassignment of resources established in for health matters, and that reduced some flows in terms of climate change. We see a scenario in which it is clear to have funding, and it's increasing, but the problem is that we are not achieving mobilization of the amount of funding, but also in terms of the quality of funding. For now, we can talk about how financing is reducing emissions, and we don't have proof of what has been mobilized Some figures say there are 600 billion per year, according to CPI, but we don't know for certain if that resource is really reducing emissions or vulnerability. What I'm going to present is some data about how we're seeing funding mobilization in the region with some trends that we should analyze. And I'd like to call your attention on the fact that currently in the framework of the climate change negotiations, we are discussing the design of a new funding target. We know that it's enough, and the question is how much we need. And how much we need to discuss internationally to cover the needs of developing countries. What you see here, and this is an analysis of trends of 20 countries that emit the most in Latin America and the Caribbean to understand some of their actions. It's interesting to say that funding for development, generally speaking, is still flowing in the region, and funding related to climate change has increased in some countries, but even inside the broad development agenda, funding for climate change is quite limited. What does this mean? That although there are countries that access this funding, what is available for climate change has not mainstreamed funding flows. So there's a trend more funding for climate change, but we haven't reached broad mobilization. Some countries as Cuba, Costa Rica, out of a total of their funding for development have increased the percentage related to climate change. Of course, there are many other resources. The main problem we have observed along the last years with cooperation and international funding is that a lot of funding in the region is through loans. That means that is funding that countries will have to give back at a certain point of their history, and that's through public funding. There are countries who do have access to funding through donations that they don't have to pay back. What do we see? Debt issues are generating a bigger international debate day by day. There is currently a process to reform the international financial sector or industry, and one of the big demands of developing countries is that we cannot sustain such a debt system. You perhaps have heard about the Bridgetown Agenda initiative by Mia Motley. She says we can't sustain such a financial system that keeps countries indebted. And that's one of the trends. When we go back and analyze each one of the financial instruments and mechanisms, Latin America and the Caribbean is not the main destination of international funding. It's the third region after Asia, Pacific, and Africa. Inside Latin America, however, we see an allocation that is imbalanced. Some countries are able to access this funding, but not all in the same way. And you can see that here. Countries like Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Colombia have received funding from the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, yes, it's GCF, but others not so much and not so constantly. It's very limited. What's happening with the financing received from the climate investment funds? These mechanisms through multilateral development banks, such as the IDB and the African Bank and others in Latin America, these are accrued figures of countries that have accessed these resources. Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, and Colombia have received the most. And there's a case of the GEF, the Global Environmental Fund. This is historical. Everything that has been accessed since the funds were started until 2022. And this is GEF. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia are the main ones. to access to this kind of funding. And this is more or less for you to see the trends in terms of resource allocation. I would insist then in the point that although there are financing flows, the distribution among countries is not equitable. Not all countries have access in the same way. We have seen new trends in the region. Countries that start to work with other kinds of instruments like debt instruments. These are green and sustainable bonds. And this is information we got from the IDB platform. Some countries like Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia, and Mexico have issued green sustainable bonds, and these are public. There's a platform too for private bonds, so you can get to know the trends. Excuse me. I can't hear him, sorry.
Perdón. Esto de esta distribución,
Regarding this unequal distribution of funds,
principal razón.
which is the main reason for that? We normally listen that GCF doesn't give money for adaptation. It just gives a little bit of for mitigation. It's not perhaps the funds, the limiting factor, but something happens concerning access. Do you have any hint, any hypothesis in this regard? Excuse me, I have just a few minutes for the presentation. Let's talk about this later so I can finish my presentation. Thank you very much. And these are some other instruments and trends. This is carbon taxation. Some countries have already started doing this. This is for 2022, Uruguay, Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia have done so. Something we have studied too is the role of national development banks, and we have observed that there's demand for investment in renewable energy. Many banks still invest in fossil fuels, and we have observed some trajectories here. Something to highlight in this graph is that during the pandemic, some trends to invest more in renewable energies was increased during the pandemic, and fossil fuels in response to generating more and more financial resources is coming down. Something I don't have time to talk, but we do sustainable finance index to understand the gap between what is invested, what is allocated sustainably in countries versus what's invested in carbon intensive activities. And we also analyze what is the sustainable income of countries as compared to carbon-intensive income. We understand that there's more and more resources related to climate change, but resources devoted to fossil fuels are not changing very much. These are the four variables we use. In sustainable income, some countries as Cuba, out of a total development for their funding, 49% is related to climate change. Much of the resource they have available from international cooperation can help development in this regard. This is the public budget case. There is a mistake. Mexico is not really up there. But out of the public budget, Guatemala just relates 2.9% of its budget to climate change. And we see that countries in our region are not spending too many national resources in climate change. And we depend a lot on fossil income. Ecuador, Mexico, Brazil depend a lot on fossil fuels to generate revenues. That's a case of Ecuador. Almost 35% of their revenues come from fossil fuels. And this implies how much our countries are spending in public investment related to fossil fuels, producing oil. This is the case of Bolivia. Almost 20% of their public budget goes to production of fossil fuels. It's true that in the region there's progress made. We have not achieved, as any country in the world, we must say, to balance funding to more sustainable ones, but that is the trajectory. And this is an analysis of what is sustainable as compared to fossil. I won't I won't give you too many details, but countries that are more dependent on fossil fuels tend to have less sustainable finances, and that's an obvious correlation, but it's interesting to see it in figures. Many challenges on climate financing and access. And just 1 second to give you some recommendations. I would close by saying that it's very important for countries in the region to work in a more structural way in planning. National climate funding strategies are important to define how to implement NDCs, adaptation policies, and this should go hand in hand with much more structural analyses in terms of revenues, establish taxes to carbon and other mechanisms, but also in terms of budget. It's important to integrate climate change in budgetary headings beyond the environmental change. This transition is very important, and this to improve needs to be together with transparency schemes. Knowing where resources are is a big tool to be able to change and close investment gaps as we are having in the region. I'll leave it at this. I can talk to you later on as you wish. I will leave the presentation with you. I invite you to the official presentation of this from October 22nd to 26th. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandra. I think that everything to be talked needs an open space. We need more tables there, perhaps. We'll go to a panel of experiences, strategies, and strategies of mobilizing finance resources for climate funding in the region. I'd like to invite the moderator of this session. And while the other panelists are connected, because they'll be connected virtually, I will introduce Raul Delgado, leader specialist on climate change at the IDB, where he participates in planning and executing the climate change agenda. He works on NDCs, long-term strategies, and fiscal policies for climate. He is also part of the technical secretariat in the platform for climate change at the Ministry of Economy and Finance. So they incorporate climate change in their policies. And he's also a member of Let's Lag. We welcome you, Raul, to moderate this panel. And I'd also like to introduce, while they start connections, Juan Carlos Huasca and Paola Vizca, who will be with us in this session virtually. Juan Carlos has been a consultant of financial entities and insurance companies on risk management, and he has been advisor of the Guarantee Fund for Financial Institutions, juridical vice president of GM Financial, the Polar in Colombia, and the superintendents of domiciled public services or utilities. He works at La Polar de Colombia, and he is a consultant at the WWF Colombia and the Global Green Growth Institute that regulates Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, and also the Colombia Climate Asset Disclosure Initiative and GIZ to design impact funds in circular economy. I can't see Juan Carlos. Juan Carlos, welcome. And Paola Vizca is an economist. She is connected from Uruguay. She has worked since 2010 in the climate change division of the Environment Ministry in Uruguay, particularly in low carbon development. She has participated in the Uruguay policy on climate change, the first commitments under the Paris Agreement and other policy instruments focused on climate change as indexed sovereign bond related to climate change, which she will talk about during this panel. And Sandra, I'm sorry, please, you are here with us in the panel, so you can continue. This is the right moment to share whatever you want to say. Thank you very much, Raul. Thank you very much, Sandra, for your presentation. It's excellent to have a global overview of what's happening with the financial flows for Latin America. Before going to the session, I'd like to comment something that I think is to be highlighted in this public funding overview in Latin America, or outlook in Latin America. There are 4 things there. Changes on how public policies are programmed and developed that are conducive with or aligned to the financial flows that exist. 2, there's a clear need in Latin America of counting on resources for project preparation. You might have a solid public policy, but if you don't have resources and capacities for pre-investment and project design that makes sure that they are designed, operated, and built sustainably, we won't see that transformation. 3, even if you have the current legal framework for the financial flow and you have a capacity for creating these investment projects from the start so as for them to be sustainable, but you don't have developed markets, whether financial markets with a specific financial product for this specific project, we won't see that. If we don't have value chains aligned to new technologies, we won't see that funding flow. And the fourth is that even if we have the right climate policy, the projects are robustly designed. There are the markets for that product. There are reasons for which the projects can't see light. And it's because the financial cost for investing in that project is too high. Perhaps the risk perception of investors about new technologies or new business models is so high that the interest rate for their funding is impossible to pay. So, with this global framework, the first question I'd like to ask Sandra, which is also derived from her presentation, is trying not to be simplistic. What are the main reasons you identify for limiting financial flows? Is it resource availability, or is it the lack of good projects, or the lack of public policies? Where is the problem? Thank you very much. And I'll connect that to the question asked by the colleague. I think it's a combination of factors, and it depends a lot on the kind of financing. What we have observed as the Green Climate Fund, accessing the GCF is very costly in financial terms and in time terms. The teams in the countries are small teams, and sometimes it's difficult to do specific follow-up. And it's also developing capacities for project development. I don't like bankable projects. I don't like that word, but we need some degree of structuring of those projects so they are operational in the field and sustainable. Sometimes project construction implies knowledge that is not always there, and not always project developers are related to realities. It's not lack of money. There are more and more resources, but there is a lack of connection between those who develop projects and those who implement projects. I think we have to connect access schemes in a much better way. Triangulation is not effective. Many organizations that help implementation are left with lots of the funding and they don't land. I don't think there's just one answer, and it depends a lot of private funding too. The public sector is a different thing. We have to improve project development, the capacity of those who implement and monitor. It's not only ex ante, but also ex post. We have to make sure that it's a landed mechanism. But the GCF or the adaptation fund have to learn to become more flexible. They measure countries with the same pole, and financing is incredibly inequitable and inflexible. Not all countries have the same conditions, and that has to be reflected in the financial schemes. Thank you very much, Sandra. Excellent points you have raised. And based upon this, a number of difficulties, I'd like to ask you a question, Juan Carlos, that is more specific. What is the kind of regulatory environment we need? What are the changes in the country's regulatory policy that would lead to increased sustainable funding?
Perfect. Yes, thank you. First of all, I'm very thankful. Thank you for inviting the Colombian Ministry of the Environment to this panel. And well, here I would like to use a couple of slides. I don't know if they are available yet. Anyway, regarding funding and regulatory framework, they have their origin in the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement established many international treaties before that one were focused on purely environmental and biodiversity matters. Article 2.1 subsection C is important. It says that we must have financial flows at a level that's compatible with the trajectory. It leads towards resilient development with low gas emissions. So there must be a reduction, and the 1.5 degrees Celsius must be maintained. And so this is where we started discussing what is sustainable finance, and this is where we see that there must be at least 3 criteria. First one is that incidents in the financial institutions, and there was a modified financial risk. Financial risk means that we had to include environmental and social risks. There must also be support for sustainable investment and have resource mobilization through financial mechanisms. And here we start doing the link with what Sandra said. There's like a short circuit between the funders and the receivers, or those who need the resources. In the next slide, please, we're going to see what is the regulatory environment. Colombia has been receiving technical assistance from the IMF, the World Bank, and very important organizations in charge of participating in this. The first topic, first there was the issuance of some guides for theme bonds. What are these? Green bonds, blue bonds, brown bonds. bonds that whose let's say that the resources that are captured on financial markets are used for environmental projects. And thus the investors that acquire these financial instruments like insurance companies, pension funds, banks, portfolio managers, well, in their investment policies, they must assess risk management, ESG risks and risks associated to climate change. The third element, please, is that the stock markets should create parameters and mechanisms to deliver information to the market, once again, for ESG aspects in climate change. Why? So that the markets are completely transparent in terms of instruments, so that this can facilitate in creating financial markets. Another element, please, is the role of central banks. Central banks must start issuing regulations to measure the macroeconomic impact, climate change, and the stability of financial and capital markets. Although it's true that the central banks have the role of maintaining financial stability, the stability of financial markets, we have started seeing how climate change can create excess rainfall, for example. And for example, the portfolios related to agriculture and farming will have important default, and this can impact financial stability. And so the authorities must start regulating, measuring how climate change affects financial stability of banks and research providers. Following element is the bank's social environmental risk management. There must be new variables to provide credits regarding possible default. Very well. Next element is green protocols. Banks associations are creating green protocols to give out credit and to receive savings. In that sense, these green protocols tell banks how they should behave, how they should have internal policies, trainings, how they should update their infrastructure to foster green credits, placement of green credits. A critical matter that has become more and more relevant is information report by security issuers. Currently, the parameters created by ACS Green, so the UN organization for the dissemination of financial assets. So the markets must have a clear information that's understandable, it's timely, that's consistent to motivate investors to acquire these instruments, like, for example, the thematic bonds. And that information must be reflected in governance structures and in creating new markets with innovative products, like, for example, green products, must have very good quality information. Another element, please, is the report of information by asset managers and pension funds that are vehicles to attract and place resources. And here I want to mention what we had talked about before. Since these are novelty products, these capital funds serve as resource channeling mechanisms. They structure operations, they structure new mechanisms, and they try to create the vehicles that we will now see that are more relevant, that will channel resources for sustainable funding. Another element, please, are the supervision guides for the authorities. As you know well, the financial system has to have surveillance, very close surveillance from the superintendent in our Latin American environment. They check that the regulatory environment is complied with. And this protects the consumer, protects the investor, and financial entities they have developed to do appropriate actions and have a good management of their risks. This is important so that when there are adverse climate effects in a certain geographic sector, there is not a crisis in another economic sector. For example, in Colombia, there were some tornadoes in some areas didn't happen before, and they destroyed many hotels. So the insurance companies had to pay, and they tried, and they discovered that they were not structured for climate change. And so new needs, new regulation, and supervisors must generate new parameters on how to be more demanding regarding this. This regulatory ecosystem starts being objective, starts being landed, it uses sustainable finance. And why? For the big risk, for the big matter that we must all protect and avoid, which is greenwashing. Greenwashing, you can put it there, please. Greenwashing, as you all know, is creating an image of green or sustainability for operations that are not sustainable. The worst thing that can happen to an organization is to say that it's sustainable when actually it's not, and this will create problems in the market. And the last topic that I had for you, and I want to relate this to the question of how do we ground this in financial instruments. I have expressed this in 6 groups of instruments. First, credit, most common one. Credit is to be sustainable, it has to follow 2 parameters, Ecuador principles and taxonomy. Second item, carbon markets, with the creation of what we call the ITMOs in English, international transfers for mitigation certificates, and another instrument used in certain countries that we call ETS. ETS is in English. These are coupons for carbon emissions. Then we have a third element, which are the thematic bonds. A fourth element that I like very much is the design of financial instruments. Here we create impact funds and what we call a blended finance, which are structured finances. They are all focused on the sustainability. The fifth element are the parametric insurances that start covering different mechanisms, not necessarily when there are accidents, but for example, by measuring how the accident happened or the event happened, like for example, landslides, storms, floods. These schemes of parametric insurance is changing very much with climate change. The sixth element is the debt conversion instruments. These are instruments that are tied to sovereign debt. Countries like Colombia, Chile, Paraguay have green sovereign debt. So there are tools to manage this debt or convert this debt, and they're called swaps. And so they regulate cash flows and others versus environmental services. And so these are the 6 groups of financial instruments. And I want to go back to the 4th one, the blended finance. These are very well structured mechanisms which allows to channel donation resources, government resources, guarantees, debts, subordinated debt, a series of instruments that will that create a very specific dynamic that's very related with sustainable needs. There are wonderful examples of blended finance, including projects to protect certain environments, oceans, coral reefs. And so this is a mechanism that's very dynamic and adjustable, and it can really contribute to cover very specific needs and to protect the environment, sustainability, and sustainable development. So that's my approach of financial instruments and of how a regulatory environment, and I insist we must avoid greenwashing through funding. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Sandra told us how the flows are doing, where the challenges are. Then Juan Carlos told us about regulatory improvement, where the areas where we have to have an impact on to strengthen financial flows. And now I want to listen to Paola Vizcarra from the Ministry of the Environment in Uruguay so that she can tell us about a precise instrument. Last year, Uruguay issued the first sustainable bond that was indexed on climate change targets. And Paula, I would like to know why this instrument is relevant for climate change and how is it different from other sovereign bonds issued by the countries. But how must this type of instrument must be translated in the country's climate change targets? Please go ahead, Paola. Oops, I think you were muted. Oh, same problem than yesterday. No audio.
No. Danos un segundo, estamos checando porque seguimos sin escucharte, Paula. ¿Mm? Okay. Denos un minuto, va a salir Paola y va a entrar otra vez. Si se tarda más de un minuto, entonces regreso contigo, Sandra. No llega, yo creo que. No regresa, entonces si quieren, hay manera de avisarle que ahorita que se conecte regresamos con ella, pero para...
Let's tell her, let's move forward. Sandra, back to you. The question was more logical with Paola, but well, let me ask you, Sandra. Talked about certain instruments were financial flows or larger or smaller depending on the countries. which are the Paola, we will be back to you in a second. So, which of these instruments can have a stronger impact on the climate agenda? Not all instruments are the same. They cannot all create the same level of climate impact. Some are very noisy. However, evidence shows very little results. But now to you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your amazing questions because they are very complex. And I believe that there is no straight answer because it really depends on the sectors. Something that we've analyzed is that the kind of funding that you can destinate to mitigation projects in the energetic or transportation sector must be instruments that escalate the funding to amounts that allow technological transformation, and this is not possible with donations. In that sense, you need instruments that allow to leverage, for example, blended finance. It has to do with how to increase, but I think that public-private participation and scale investments have helped with sectors. For example, in the electromobility process that many of you know well, we have had these investments in technological terms and also in terms of regulatory investment, because that's another process. But when you go to the side of adaptation, on the adaptation side, you do require instruments that have a lesser risk aversion. You must be able to invest in a project because adaptation is not reached by a technological change. It's not like with mitigation, where you can change the technology in the vehicle to have an impact. Adaptation is a process that implies transformations at a scale that is temporarily not visible in a year. And so many of the people invest say, I want to see results right now, but adaptation doesn't work like that. You need mechanisms that donations or investments that have to do with small enterprises with social impact. And these are smaller enterprises, but they have more community impacts. And so it really depends on the sector, it depends on the scale of the funding and who executes it. Who executes it? And I think that this makes funding mechanisms very complex because there is not something imperfect for players. And so this is why it's important to have these diverse financial strategies that allow you to translate an NDC into an implementation plan. Not all sectors and projects will have the same resource. And so it's important to have a package and not only something perfect. Thank you very much, Sandra. And now let's go back to Paola, see if your audio is working. So the question has to do with what is the experience of Uruguay in issuing the first sustainable bond that's indexed to climate change criteria? How is it different from other instruments, and how does it contribute with NDCs in Uruguay?
Danos un segundo. A ver, vamos a ver.
Disculpen, ¿a mí me escuchan? Soy
Can you
Lorena.
hear me? I'm Lorena. I'm Paola's colleague. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Paola should come here. I will leave.
Buenísimo.
Right.
Yo también. Bueno, intentemos.
Trying to go back.
Trato de bajar la presentación de pago, pero ya viene, ya que está, aprovecho y saludo a los colegas que están allí de
Ya.
particular.
Let me,
Por temas de tiempo, si quieren ahorita
okay, due to time constraints, we will come back to you in a
con
minute.
Juan Carlos de regreso. Juan Carlos,
And
ya
I'm going to Juan Carlos.
un poco, Sandra,
Sandra told us about
marco general
this general framework of instruments that can be useful. And there's an instrument that's creating a lot of noise today, a lot of interest in the region. Two countries have issued green taxonomies, in particular Colombia and Mexico. The case of Colombia, well, Colombia has become an international and a regional reference. And we would like to ask you, we know that different banks in the country, in Colombia, have started to carry on certain pilot exercises to incorporate the taxonomy in their processes. Can you tell us what the experience has been until now with these pilot programs and how the taxonomy should increase those sustainable financial flows from now on? Please go ahead, Juan Carlos. Yeah, good point. As I was saying a moment ago, Colombia has tried to carry on different efforts for sustainable finances. Colombia was the first Latin American country that applied a taxonomy. We use the European taxonomy model because there are many models. And that taxonomy has four big elements. The first one is that the operations that have to be financed in the regarding the operations in the list. And that's important because it's going to give a very objective reference to the funder and to the side that demands the resources. The second element is that these financing operations, it has to show that it has a financial impact. And the factor that's the most used in the world today is the indicator of the carbon indicator, amount of metric tons that are emitted or that are not emitted, and it must not harm another environmental indicator. For example, if I want to process water through a wastewater plant, the energy consumption must not be as high. It must not be so high that it produces more greenhouse effect gases. And the fourth element is that we must respect social safeguards in that operation. And so, with these four elements that the taxonomy requires, different banks in Colombia started applying it. And what did they find? First of all, they found that the measurement of the impact under the greenhouse effect gas parameters is something that's not completely put into practice. There are many sectors of the economy that have not defined this. Many sectors of the economy find that it's very difficult to measure them, and they don't have the capacity to comply with this requirement. The second element is that financiers in the organizations don't know how this works. They don't know how to measure this environmental and social risk. They have not established it. They have not measured it. They're not clear on how incidents would be in terms of financing operations. And then the financial entities are not clear on how to measure and assess the social safeguards. This is why in Colombia there are we're generating many policies on how organizations do gender projects, how they protect special social groups, indigenous communities, where this is required. and protecting children. This is an important factor that we must know and that we must deepen in financial institutions, and it's still under construction. And the fourth element is not harming significantly other environmental indicators. And so this also has to do with measurement. And so taxonomy is a huge effort, and its big goal is to channel resources for sustainable funding, avoiding greenwashing. And so in that tension, in dealing with these two pieces of criteria, there is a taxonomy requirements, and the financial entities are still in the process of grounding this so that it's possible. Big efforts have been done. There have been trainings. There has been regulation, and we expect that in 1 or 2 years, this is more and more grounded so that we can go deeper in that. And just to finish, the private capital funds that channel resources importantly and that are not subject to financial regulation that can be very rigorous are also starting to apply the taxonomy, and they tell their investors that their resources are placed under those parameters and they have other dynamics, but they still apply that so that the resources are channeled appropriately. And so taxonomy, in a nutshell, is a very important progress. It contributes to sustainable finance, but it requires a lot of construction so that the resources can reach the person that need them most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos. Excellent. I think Paola is connected now, and she has an audio. Hello. Yes, I think it's going okay now. Well, first of all, I wanted to apologize for the technical problem. I don't know what happened. Just a moment before I was at another meeting and it was working. So I had my colleague who was following the event also, and we're okay now. Thank you very much, Raul, and let's thank the organizers for this invitation to share the Uruguayan experience or some aspects of the emission of the sustainable bond, sovereign and sustainable, and it's tied to climate change indicators. According to the question, I wanted to describe the instrument. First of all, for those who are not very close to this kind of topic, can have an idea of what this is all about. Precisely, I think it's good to clarify that from the start, there is a direct connection with the NDCs. That is, inside the sustainability-linked bonds, we were not the first one. I think we were the second country after Chile in issuing this instrument. Perhaps what's different as compared to sovereign bonds are at large, the green bonds that are also mentioned are an instrument that is much more used and has a longer trajectory as compared to the SLVs. They are focused in concrete projects with a certain goal. These are funds or debt issued by the government that goes to general income. That's what we call it in income. Right. It's the public money pocket, let's say. But it's tied to indicators that indirectly force a country to follow some conditions. The global economy and global environment indicators that are beyond the project of what would be a regular green bond. In the case of Uruguay, this broad view is related to the NDC objectives and two indicators were defined based upon Uruguay's first NDC. Our first NDC was published in 2017 with a horizon to 2025. Since we didn't have updating in 2020 and that of 2015 was the first one, we had some sort of a mismatch. So we had one to 2025 and another published in 2022 has an horizon to 2030. This bond that was designed much before the of publishing the second NDC is related to the first NDC. Although Uruguay in this first NDC has intensity indicators per gas, among its objectives, it has reduction of the intensity of emissions of CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane on the GDP, like the numeral and the denominator, right? But the idea was to simplify things because the investor world does not necessarily understand why we have three intensity indicators instead of one. We have three because we have a very particular matrix, because we have lots of methane because of our cattle raising, and this is why I wanted to make the difference with the other two, CO and nitrous oxide. And so we have an indicator for CO2 equivalent intensity on GDP, and the objective of the indicator is to reduce CO2 equivalent over or on GDP as compared to the 1990. And we also have an indicator that was well considered by the CO2 equivalent on GDP, which was maintaining native forest areas. We do have an area that we're trying to keep in its native forest. That NDC objective was taken as such for as one of the indicators in this instrument. Another novelty in this instrument is, and it's first in this one, it has a step up and a step down. It means that if a country achieves the objective and goes beyond that, exceeds, it will have an award in the interest rate. It won't only be punished if it doesn't reach it, but in a range between 50% of reduction and 52% of reduction, it will pay the established rate. And if it exceeds and reduces more than 52%, there will be an award in the interest rate. The same thing for the forest. Between 100 and 103% conservation, it pays the original rate. But if it exceeds 103% or it increases the native forest area as compared to the reference, then the rate has reduced. That was a novelty and incentivizes our efforts to reach as much as we can in connection to those indicators. This is an incentive that the market acknowledges and values. If the country makes additional efforts that allow bigger standard, we have a financial award. It's a way to internalize the value of the effort made by the country. We are aware about the fact that the objectives are very ambitious. In the second NDC, we try, as the Paris Agreement states, to have a more ambitious NDC, but Uruguay's NDC is very ambitious already. It won't be easy, but what's important is to show how the financial market is acknowledging those circumstances and values the efforts of developing countries such as ours. One more thing before going to the links. I think that the IDB and, I'm sorry, I want to mention that the IDB and the UNDP mentioned us in terms of verification resources. That's fundamental because if we don't give all guarantees and ensure transparency about measurement and verification, we won't have success. It was a very successful mission. The demand tripled what the country issued. So verification is very important to give investors security. We were supported by the UNDP to define how we would go about doing verification. We also improved the measurement system we had within the framework of the convention. I think we have always had a good performance in that, and the IDB helped us technically at the beginning by starting this conversation and also with resources for organizations to become strengthened when we designed this work. It was very challenging. It took 2 years. Now, about going beyond the instrument and the relevance the issue has, I think the most important is that it brings together financing and climate at macro level. And this is something I hadn't seen so clearly, at least in Uruguay. And it's something that is very interesting because we are internalizing these issues. In Uruguay, many industries were like far from the issue, but now they dived into it and did something about it. We always say that the political economy is strengthened in a virtuous circle when you incorporate these issues in financing with domestic and international players. Maybe the public knows more a little bit about the economy and less about the environment. They get to know and understand the global logic and ways to face climate change beyond theory, science, or climate change scenarios. There are things that, besides the things we do at home every day, incorporate the climate change as an issue. So the entire society, through the newspapers, newsletters, etc., talked about this. And these are like indirect instruments for dissemination. And we understand the importance of progressing. And there is also an incentive for some measures to become more specific, not only in the national but subnational governments. In this way, they are more aware about what can be done to face climate change. I think that's super important. I just finished. Thank you very much, Paola. I'd like to highlight something. We cannot sufficiently highlight the fact that a country has linked the cost of their sovereign debt and the reaching their NDC and SDC targets. We would have loved to pass the floor to a person who asked the question, but we have no more time. Thank you very much, Sandra, Juan Carlos, and Paola, for your presentations. And Lorena, thank you very much for your presentations. Thank you. Thank you very much, Raul. Again, Raul, Sandra, Juan Carlos, and Paola, thank you very much for your contributions. Now, to conclude with this session, we propose a small debate around your tables as you are, and Raul and Sandra can also be added to the tables. So take 10 minutes for a debate around the tables, sharing progress, experience, in initiatives you know, and that can facilitate mobilization of funding. And focusing the second question, particularly what common needs do you identify in the region to mobilize funding, and what collaboration opportunities you consider relevant according to what you have heard and to what you bring to the debate. So 10 minutes to discuss. You can share and write collaboration opportunities and common needs in your post-its, and please come forth and stick them on the panel there. Just 10 minutes, so you discuss around your tables, and then you share your post-its, and then we'll pass this to motivate debate. Then we'll go to our coffee break, and we have to come back at 11. So 10 minutes for sharing ideas, and then we go to the coffee break. Thank you very much.